The red, on air, sign above the studio doors glowed like a warning signal as Mark Wahlberg stepped out of his dressing room at the Jimmy Kimmel Live studios. He had done hundreds of interviews in his career, early morning radio shows, late night TV, red carpet chaos, but something about tonight felt off. Maybe it was the rushed phone call from his publicist that afternoon. Or the vague note in the briefing email that read, potentially sensitive topics, handled with humor. Mark didn't like surprises. The hallway buzzed with assistants carrying clipboards, producers whispering into headsets, and interns pretending not to stare. Mark gave a polite nod here and there, his jaw tight, his expression unreadable. At 50+, he was still in incredible shape, still a box office draw, still Mark Wahlberg, but he was also more guarded now. Less willing to play along when things crossed a line. 2 minutes, Mark, a young production assistant said nervously. Got it, Mark replied, forcing a half smile. Behind the curtain, the familiar sound of Jimmy Kimmel's monologue echoed through the studio. The audience laughed loudly, obediently, at jokes about politicians, celebrities, and the absurdity of Hollywood life. Mark listened closely as he waited, arms folded. And coming up after the break, Jimmy said cheerfully, a guy who wakes up at 3:30 in the morning just to remind the rest of us how lazy we are, Mark Wahlberg. The crowd erupted in applause. Mark exhaled slowly. All right, he thought. Just another interview. The band struck up their music, and Mark walked onto the stage to thunderous cheers. He waved, smiled wider this time, and shook Jimmy's hand before sitting down. Mark Wahlberg, everybody. Jimmy said, beaming. You look annoyingly healthy, as always. Mark chuckled. That's what happens when you go to bed when most people are still eating dinner. The audience laughed. So, Jimmy continued, glancing at his cards, new movie, new business ventures, new insane workout schedule. You ever just wake up and think, you know what? I'll be normal today. Mark smiled politely. Every day. Then I remember I don't know how. The banter was smooth at first. They talked about the film Mark was promoting, a gritty action drama with awards buzz. Mark spoke passionately about the cast, the director, the message behind the story. Jimmy nodded, played along, tossed in jokes. It was going well. Too well. Jimmy leaned back slightly, grinning. Now Mark, you've been very open lately about personal growth, reflection, even regret. Mark's smile faded just a fraction. Yeah, I think that comes with age. Sure, Jimmy said, which brings me to something the internet never forgets. The audience murmured softly, sensing a shift. Mark glanced toward the crowd, then back at Jimmy. Okay. Jimmy held up a photo on the screen behind them, an old tabloid image from Mark's early years, tied to one of the most controversial moments of his past. People still bring this up, Jimmy said lightly, and some say Hollywood just kind of forgave you. The laughter this time was nervous, scattered. Mark's jaw tightened. I've talked about that, he said carefully. A lot. I've apologized. I've worked to do better. Right, Jimmy replied quickly. But don't you think it's fair for people to question? Question what? Mark interrupted, his tone calm but firm. Jimmy blinked, surprised. Well, accountability. Whether success lets some people off the hook easier than others. The studio grew quieter. Mark leaned forward slightly. I don't think success erases anything. I think growth matters. I've spent decades trying to make amends privately, not for applause. A few audience members clapped. Others stayed silent. Jimmy smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Of course. But since you're so open now, I figured, why not talk about it again? Mark stared at him. That's not what we agreed on backstage. A sharp intake of breath rippled through the front rows. Jimmy laughed awkwardly. Well, you know, this is live TV. Mark nodded slowly. Yeah, I know. There was a pause, longer than any late-night host liked. The band stayed silent. The cameras lingered. Mark straightened in his chair. Look, I came here to talk about the movie. The work. Not to rehash something I've taken responsibility for over and over. Jimmy shrugged. Hey, the audience likes honesty. Mark's eyes hardened. So do I. The tension was now unmistakable. Social media interns backstage were already typing furiously. Jimmy tried to pivot. Okay, let's lighten it up. You still waking up at 3:30 a.m. to pray, work out, cure world hunger? A few laughs broke out. Mark didn't laugh. Jimmy, he said evenly, you just tried to corner me on something you know is painful. Then you want to joke like nothing happened. Jimmy raised his eyebrows. That's kind of the job. Mark shook his head. No. The job is respect. Especially when someone sets a boundary. The audience erupted, half applause, half stunned silence. Jimmy's smile vanished. Are you saying I disrespected you? I'm saying, Mark replied, voice steady but intense, this feels less like an interview and more like a setup. The band leader glanced nervously at the producer off camera. Jimmy leaned forward now. You're on a comedy show, Mark. If you can't handle a tough question. Mark stood up. Gasps filled the studio. I can handle tough questions, Mark said, towering beside his chair. I won't handle cheap ones. Jimmy stood as well, clearly flustered. Sit down. We're not done. Yes, we are, Mark replied. The on air sign still glowed. Millions were watching. Mark turned toward the audience. Thank you for your time, he said sincerely. I appreciate the support. Then he looked back at Jimmy. Good luck with the rest of the show. Jimmy opened his mouth to respond, but Mark was already walking off stage. The curtain closed behind him as the crowd buzzed in shock, some cheering, some confused, all aware they had just witnessed something unscripted, raw, and impossible to ignore. Jimmy stood frozen for a moment, then forced a laugh. Well, Mark Wahlberg, everyone. The band kicked in, too loud, too fast. Backstage, Mark didn't slow down. His publicist rushed after him, pale. Mark, what happened? Mark stopped, finally exhaling. What shouldn't have? Outside the studio, headlines were already being drafted. The moment Mark Wahlberg stepped into the cool Los Angeles night, the studio doors slammed shut behind him, sealing off the chaos he'd just left behind. Inside, producers scrambled. Outside, phones buzzed like angry hornets. Within minutes, the clip was everywhere. Mark Wahlberg walks off Jimmy Kimmel Live. Unscripted meltdown shocks Hollywood. WHO was right, Mark or Jimmy. Mark sat in the back of his SUV, staring out the window as the city lights blurred past. His publicist, Dana, scrolled frantically through her phone. It's trending worldwide, she said. Twitter, TikTok, YouTube, people are dissecting every second. Mark nodded. I figured. Some are backing you, Dana continued. Saying you set a boundary. Others think you overreacted. Mark closed his eyes briefly. They weren't in the room. Inside the studio. Back at Jimmy Kimmel Live, the atmosphere was tense. The band had gone to commercial early. Crew members whispered in clusters. Jimmy stood near his desk, jacket off now, running a hand through his hair. That wasn't supposed to happen, a senior producer said quietly. Jimmy exhaled sharply. He walked off. That's on him. Jimmy, another producer replied carefully, we did promise his team we wouldn't dig into that. Jimmy looked up. It's a talk show. I didn't ambush him. The producer hesitated. It felt like one. Jimmy didn't respond. Instead, he stared at the empty chair where Mark had been sitting just minutes earlier. For the first time that night, doubt crept in. The internet decides. By morning, the clash had taken on a life of its own. Clips were slowed down, zoomed in, analyzed frame by frame. Body language experts weighed in. Former late-night hosts offered opinions. Fans picked sides like it was a championship fight. One viral comment read, Mark Wahlberg didn't lose his temper, he reclaimed his dignity. Another shot back, if you go on a late-night show, expect tough questions. Hashtags split the internet in two. Hashtag Team Mark. Hashtag Team Jimmy. Talk shows discussed it. Podcasts debated it. News outlets replayed the moment Mark stood up again and again, freezing on the exact second his expression changed. Hollywood noticed. Mark breaks his silence. 2 days later, Mark sat in a quiet room at his production office, facing a single camera. No audience. No jokes. Just him. The video went live on his social media platforms at noon. I want to address what happened on Jimmy Kimmel Live, Mark began, his voice calm but serious. I didn't walk off because I was angry. I walked off because I felt disrespected. He paused, choosing his words carefully. I've spent years owning my past, apologizing where it mattered, and working to be better than the man I was. I'm not perfect, but I won't allow my mistakes to be used as entertainment. The comments section exploded. I respect Jimmy, Mark continued. But respect goes both ways. When you set a boundary and it's crossed, You have a choice, to stay silent, or to stand up. I chose the latter. The video ended without drama. No accusations. No insults. Just honesty. Jimmy's dilemma. Jimmy Kimmel watched the video alone in his office. For years, he'd been known as sharp, fearless, unafraid to poke. That image had built his career, but now it was working against him. Advertisers were nervous. Network executives were asking questions. You don't need to apologize, one exec told him on a call. But you do need to respond. That night, Jimmy returned to his desk under the studio lights. The audience applauded, but it sounded thinner than usual. Before we start, Jimmy said, looking directly into the camera, I want to talk about what happened earlier this week. The room went quiet. Mark Wahlberg and I had a moment that got heated, he admitted. Late-night TV thrives on pushing boundaries, but sometimes you push too far. A ripple of murmurs spread through the crowd. I never intended to blindside him, Jimmy continued. But intent doesn't erase impact. And I can see now why he felt the way he did. It wasn't a full apology, but it was close. Mark, Jimmy added, looking straight at the camera, if you're watching, my door is open. A private conversation. They didn't talk that night. Or the next. But a week later, Mark's phone rang while he was finishing a workout at 4 a.m. Jimmy, Mark said after a pause. There was silence on the other end for a moment. Then, I wanted to call you myself. Not through Teams. Not through press. Mark leaned against the wall. I'm listening. I messed up, Jimmy admitted. I thought I was doing my job. I forgot you're a person before you're a guest. Mark exhaled slowly. I didn't want a fight, Jimmy. I wanted fairness. I get that now. Another pause. Maybe we both could have handled it better, Mark said finally. Maybe, Jimmy agreed. Doesn't mean we can't handle it right going forward. They didn't announce the call. They didn't post about it. Some things didn't need an audience. The unexpected. Invitation. 2 months later, a surprise promo aired during Jimmy Kimmel Live. Jimmy appeared on screen, smiling. Coming up next week, he said, a conversation, not an ambush, with Mark Wahlberg. The internet lost its mind. Speculation exploded. Was it a reconciliation? A rematch? A ratings stunt? Mark's team confirmed one thing only. It will be on their terms. The return. When Mark walked onto the stage again, the applause was louder than ever. He and Jimmy shook hands, this time firmly, genuinely, and sat down. No cards, Jimmy said, placing his notes aside. Just a conversation. Mark nodded. That's all I wanted last time. They talked about growth, about mistakes, about accountability without spectacle, about what it means to evolve in public while trying to heal in private. At the end, Jimmy turned to him. I'm glad you came back, he said. So am I, Mark replied. The audience stood. Aftermath. The episode became one of the most watched of the year, not because of drama, but because of honesty. Critics called it a rare moment of maturity in late-night television. Fans praised both men for turning conflict into conversation. And Mark Wahlberg, he walked off one show, but walked into something far bigger, control over his own story.